All right, everybody, let's go ahead and get started. Good morning and welcome to the fourth and final webinar in this Spring Summer Science series that's being brought to you by both the Southeast Climate Adaptation Science Center and the South Atlantic Blueprint team. In this series, we've been highlighting Southeast Climate Adaptation Science Center projects that are especially relevant to conservation in the South Atlantic region. And this is also the July 3rd Thursday web forum for those of you who are used to tuning into that series every month. So as y'all probably know, my name's Hillary Morris. I work on user support and communications for both the South Atlantic and Southeast Conservation Blueprints. So here's what to expect from our webinar today. We'll go over some meeting logistics and then introduce today's speaker, who's Dr. John Kupfer. He's going to present for 40 minutes or so, and then we'll have some time for Q&A at the end before we wrap up with a quick preview of next month's web forum. So at this point, I'm going to hand it off to Carrie Furness with the Climate Adaptation Science Center to say a few additional words of welcome and explain the logistics for our webinar today, and that will include how to get your Society of American Foresters Continuing Forestry Education credits. So please do pay extra close attention to that if you're interested in getting your credits for this webinar. Carrie?
Thanks, Hillary, and hello, everyone. So I'd like to add my welcome to this webinar on behalf of the Southeast Climate Adaptation Science Center. We've been really glad for this opportunity to partner with the South Atlantic Conservation Blueprint team and to present some of the science that's supported by the Southeast CASC that's particularly relevant to this combined group of interested users. So as Hillary mentioned, let me quickly cover some of the features of the Zoom interface that we're using for the webinar. So as noted on the slide here, the controls are on the bottom left of your Zoom screen, allow you to connect to the audio, which you likely have already if you're hearing this. And this is also where you can mute and unmute your audio. So we're going to keep all lines muted and ask that you also keep your video off. So there, you can accidentally start and stop your video there pretty easily in that corner. So pay attention to that so we can lessen distractions during the presentation. In the middle of this bottom bar, you can see the chat window. And that I'd encourage you during the presentation, if questions come up, go ahead and throw them in the chat and we'll present them to our speaker during the Q&A session after the talk. There's also a specific request in there in that chat box. If you do wish to receive CFE credit, we're going to need you to please send Ashlyn specifically additional detail with your name and email so we can make sure that we can certify your attendance for that, for SAF. So, and as a note for those who are joining us only by phone, *6 is the code to mute and unmute your phone. Lastly, we're going to be recording this webinar, and it's going to be accessible in a couple of places afterwards. Hillary is going to post it on the calendar event on the South Atlantic LCC website, and we will also post it on our Science Series webpage on the Southeast CASC website. So now we'd like to launch a short poll just to get a little bit of information about who's with us today and help us know how to continue to get information out about these seminars. So I'm launching that now. And I'll just give you a short time, a little under a minute to fill it out. If you could go ahead and pop your information in there about your affiliation and sort of how you found out about this webinar. So. All right, looks like we're getting some good response here. Okay, it looks like we've got about 3/4 of people who have responded, so we'll give you just a few more seconds, and then we'll have a quick look at the results and then move along. So, all right, here we go. Stopping that now, and you can see the results. We've got a nice broad range of folks participating. So glad to see that breadth of folks in our audience today. So, John, that might help you anticipate some questions.
Yep, that'd be great.
So now we'll move on to our presentation, and I'm happy to introduce our speaker today, who is Dr. John Kupfer. John's a professor in the Department of Geography and affiliated faculty in the School of Earth, Ocean, and Environmental Science in the University of South Carolina. As a landscape ecologist and biogeographer, his research couples fieldwork with spatial analysis and GIS-based modeling to explore the interactive effects of landscape transformation, climate change, and disturbances such as flooding, fire, and hurricanes on plant and animal communities. Much of that work is conducted to support more effective management of public lands, and he's an active part of the Congaree Biosphere Regions Advisory Council. He also serves as the University of South Carolina's consortium PI for the Southeast Climate Adaptation Science Center. So we're glad to have him part of our group as well. So now I'll pass it on to John for your presentation. Take it away, John.
Thank you, Carrie. Come on. All right, so first of all, I want to give a big thank you to Hillary and Carrie for the invitation to present today, and I appreciate all of you taking the time to join us. And I also want to begin by noting that this research is part of a larger collaboration on prescribed fire and conservation planning in the Southeast. So while I'm giving the talk today, it also represents interactions that I've had with colleagues here at USC like Kirsten Dow and Peng Gao and Kirsten Lackstrom. It's been influenced heavily by Kevin Hires, who's at Tall Timbers, and we have a number of other projects that are going on together. And then also with Adam Tranda, who a number of you guys know is with Southeast CASC and NC State. So to begin, let me give you a little bit of background. In 2015, this group, along with some of our partners in the National Wildlife Federation, received funding from the Southeast CASC for a project that was focused on conservation adaptation planning in the Southeast. That, which has sort of been part of this broader Vital Futures project, was meant to address two major issues. Now, first, many areas within our region, as you know, are undergoing rapid transformations with human population densities, rates of land use conversion, and extensive urban systems, all projected to increase dramatically in upcoming decades. Some of you are maybe familiar, for instance, with Adam's work projecting urbanization in the Southeast, which is what you can see here on the left side of the screen. If you're like me and you like images and air photos and things like that, on the right side is a demonstration of what that looks like for a specific landscape located just outside of Bluffton, South Carolina, which is near Hilton Head, if you're not familiar with that area. And you can see the types of changes that have taken place all throughout this region and are expected to continue on for the remainder of the 21st century. Now, additional stresses on the region's ecological systems and wildlife include habitat fragmentation and the emergence of domestic and international markets for bioenergy as well. Now, regionally, federal, state, nonprofit, and private entities are seeking to coordinate conservation actions and investments to improve the health, function, and connectivity of ecosystems over the next 50 to 100 years through things like the Southeast Conservation Adaptation Strategy, or SECASC, and through other regional partnerships. One notable product that I told Hillary I would do just a quick plug for, and many of you guys are, I'm sure, already familiar with this, is the Southeast Conservation Blueprint, which is a living spatial plan that identifies shared conservation priorities across the region. And she can give a little bit more of a plug at the end of the talk for some of the efforts that they have ongoing right now and some of the things that are going to be coming up if she so chooses. Now, ongoing threats to species and ecosystems associated with landscape change come at a time when the region is also expected to experience significant climatic changes. Changes in temperature and precipitation patterns will affect species and ecosystems in complex ways as habitat conditions shift. Altered seasonal water availability driven by both changing climate and also increased water demand due to population growth and land use change throughout the region may affect our region's economy as well as our unique ecosystems and aquatic areas, with other types of changes, of course, also taking place in coastal areas that might be vulnerable to sea level rise. Changes in climate are also expected to alter fire weather, increasing wildfire risks, and as I'll talk about in a little bit, narrowing the available window for conducting prescribed burns that are crucial for maintaining or restoring ecosystems of conservation interest, such as longleaf pine, which of course will be the focus of what I'm talking about today. Now, wildfire was historically a prominent ecological process in many southeastern landscapes prior to widespread fire suppression. Lightning season fires are thought to have represented an evolutionarily significant timing for ignition, and characterization of natural fire regimes has emphasized the importance of links between fire characteristics and ecological patterns and processes. Many of us in the past few years have seen some of the highly visible examples that wildfire is still a process here in the Southeast. And we've seen those back in the news. So for instance, some of you guys I'm sure remember what you see here, the November 2016 fire outbreak. And the impacts of those fires have often been exacerbated by years of fire suppression, making the importance of prescribed burning all that much more significant as we move forward over the upcoming decades. Now, when I'm talking with folks about this, they sometimes don't realize the significance or the prominence of prescribed burning in the US. Despite all of the attention that wildfires oftentimes get in the media, the area burned in the US by prescribed fires each year actually exceeds that burned by wildfires by a fairly significant amount. And if you look at the Southeast, managers here conduct prescribed burns on more than 3 million hectares annually. So those fires are set to achieve a range of ecological, economic, and societal objectives. And prescribed fire is also a prominent tool that's used to reduce risks from wildfire. Here you can see how the increasing use of prescribed fire at Fort Benning, for instance, shown by the orange bars. So as you look at this, this is sort of the increasing use of prescribed fire going back into the early 80s, has corresponded with a decreasing number of wildfires. That, of course, is one of the major reasons why we burn in some of these areas. And what you see, especially in the Southeast then, is it's clear that fire in the landscape, at least in our area, has become a purposeful and managed process, and one that's crucial for the health of several key ecosystems and species. Now, it's also important to realize that fire in the region has an important seasonal component, which is something that I'll go into a little bit more detail on in just a while. But to give you a sense of this, this graphic shows the spatial extent of prescribed fires and indicated by the blue bars, and wildfires indicated by the orange bars by month at Eglin Air Force Base and the Florida Panhandle from 2008 through 2015. Eglin's had an extremely active prescribed fire management program over the course of the last 15 years, and what I'll point you to here is just two things. One is the overwhelming dominance of prescribed fire in an area like Eglin, which has a very active burn program. So you can see, especially in the dormant season, huge areas are being burned every year. The second thing I'll point you to, though, is the seasonal pattern of that. So even though the majority of that fire may be taking place during dormant season or early spring burns, they're burning almost all throughout the entire year with just a sort of pause in late summer and into early fall. And what's significant about that is as we start to think about how we manage prescribed fire moving forward, thinking about how weather and climate patterns change seasonally, the availability of different types of resources like machinery or humans to conduct prescribed burns has a very seasonal flow to it as well. So moving forward, what I want to note then is the importance of prescribed fire as a management tool that needs to be then considered within the context of projected changes in landscape pattern and regional climates. And that was really what the focus of Vital Futures has been, and that's what a lot of our work has sort of centered on. Rapid population growth and extensive suburban development are likely to impose constraints on prescribed burning, while also highlighting the need for active prescribed fire management to reduce wildfire risk in many communities. So what you see in these images is not all that atypical, right? We've got this wild and urban interface where people are increasingly moving into areas where we're simultaneously trying to implement regular burning processes. As a result, the frequent prescribed burning that's been so successful at reducing risk and providing conservation benefits could become more costly, could become more complex or more risky with further expansion of the wild and urban interface, or if the desired climatic conditions that govern the availability of safe and suitable days to conduct prescribed fires becomes less frequent or more erratic. Okay, and just to sort of emphasize that last point, I'll bring up this. So this was results from a study of a paper that is currently in press at the International Journal of Wildland Fire. In it, we examine how projected changes in temperature, relative humidity, and wind speed could restrict opportunities for prescribed burning in the Southeast over the remainder of the 21st century as climatic conditions increasingly fall outside of the currently recognized burn windows. So if you regularly follow the series or the one during the regular year, You might remember Adam's talk on that work last year when he talked about the shifting burn windows in the area. If you're interested in that, let me know. I'll send you preprint because it is online now and I can give it to you that way. But what I'll do is I'll give you just a quick takeaway from that here. What you see here in the top row is the percentage of days that met suitable burning conditions in winter on the left and summer months on the right for the historic period of record from 1976 to 2005. We then used output from a suite of 18 different climate models with 2 different scenarios of atmospheric change to project the future occurrence of days that meet current generalized burning guidelines. So if you get on the left, basically what you're seeing is during winter, as we move forward to maybe a conservative warming scenario or a more extreme one at the bottom, the frequency, of suitability of burn days really doesn't change all that much during the winter months. If you look at the summer, however, we go from a pattern where we frequently have 50, 60, maybe 70% of the days being suitable for burning in summer, to one by the end of the century where we may have less than 10 to 15% of days. And as a result, the summer burn window basically goes away, particularly in some of the areas along the southern part of the Southeast, and especially as you move over towards areas like Texas and Louisiana. Okay, based on that, one of the conclusions, one of the take-home messages that we have is what you see here over on the left, which is the practical constraints of rising temperatures on prescribed fire activities represent a significant future challenge and show that even meeting basic burn criteria, because what we use were really simple. I mean, there's other things beyond just temperature and wind speed and relative humidity. Even meeting those basic criteria will become increasingly difficult over time, which speaks to the need for adaptive management strategies to start thinking about what we're going to need to do with respect to burning in these areas. All right, more broadly, and I'm almost done with the intro stuff here, and then I'll get into the survey and what we've done since then, is more broadly, we argue that while conservation efforts have generally focused on protecting and managing systems to either maintain current conditions or maybe to bring about a return to some desired historic state, really what we also need to be thinking about are flexible approaches that consider how conservation planning, practices, and policies can be adapted to incorporate and address future environmental changes, such as landscape transformation and climate change. All right, which brings us to what we're doing here. So longleaf pine ecosystems provide ideal opportunities for examining what I just talked about, those things related to the design and implementation of adaptive management strategies. They're iconic ecosystems of the region. They've been severely degraded and reduced to only about 5% of their former extent as a result of fire suppression and timber harvesting and land conversion. Fire regimes have been altered significantly. And as a result, in this study, what we focus on is fire management because prescribed burning plays a particularly critical role in the management, conservation, and restoration of longleaf pine savannas and woodlands. Now, further, while there's considerable interest in protecting and managing remnant longleaf pine habitats, many of us, I'm sure, know that active management across entire landscapes is what's necessary to promote longer-term ecosystem resilience and sustainability in the face of climate change, within the context of urbanization and changing fire conditions. And we already see this perspective reflected in things like regional longleaf management plans, and you can see this one example here from the Longleaf Alliance. But there are other examples as well that focus on how we manage longleaf or other types of systems for that matter, not just within individual management units, but within a broader landscape context. And as a landscape ecologist, that's of course one of the things that I'm most interested in. All right, given then projected changes in key environmental factors that constrain prescribed burning, things like climate change or landscape change, it's clear that predicting the future of fire is going to require a better understanding of whether environmental criteria defined by managers, which is who you'll be hearing from today, who conduct prescribed fires can still be met, thereby allowing fire to be maintained on the landscape and in associated fire-dependent ecosystems. For example, the sensitivity of the decision-making process to weather conditions suggests that long-term shifts in the distribution of meteorological variables might strongly impact future opportunities for prescribed burning, the risks faced by managers conducting those burns, or more likely both of those. The ability of fire managers to utilize prescribed fire as a management tool is further complicated in places like the Southeast, which is characterized by rapid population growth and extensive urban and suburban development, which then imposes further constraints on prescribed burning, while also highlighting the necessity of an active prescribed fire management regime to reduce wildfire risk. Doing so requires information on the practices and constraints currently involved in longleaf pine management, which brings us to today. So essentially the study objectives that we have are focused on getting information from longleaf pine fire managers regarding criteria for prioritizing burn sites, information on current burning practices and constraints, and then some of their expectations for future constraints with an emphasis on their perceptions related to urbanization and climate change.
John, this is Carrie. Sorry
Yep.
to interrupt. There's a box that's showing on your slides. I don't know if you can move that away just to lessen that distraction.
Sorry about that.
It's all right.
I don't know if that was warning me.
It's given some warning, but we can also.
Please move this window away from shared application.
Yeah.
Sorry to interrupt, but it's.
Yeah, I'm glad you did that.
Help.
I thought maybe that was just a warning for me, and I'm trying to do stuff with it. I'm not sure what it's doing.
It's not the end of the world because we can kind of see behind it.
Yeah, but I understand as well. So I don't.
But it's not if it was easy. If it's an easy fix, do it. If not, carry on.
Let me do this real quick. Try and restart this and see. Nope.
Still there, but carry on.
Sorry about that, y'all. I'm not sure. I've never had that when I've been doing talks like this, so I'm not sure why that's. I'm not sure why that's coming up. So pretend that it's not there.
Fair
I know
enough.
that's really irritating too, because I know when things like that come up, or if people have verbal tics, you sort of get used to, you can't look away once you start to notice something. So I'm not sure why that's there. Anyway, sorry about that. So the survey that we're doing then is, or what I'll be talking about today, is results of an online survey of longleaf pine fire managers, focused on those who work throughout the entire historic range of longleaf, that we implemented through Qualtrics, which is an online survey tool that a number of you guys may be familiar with. Individual managers were invited to participate in the survey through the Southern Fire Exchange newsletter, the Drip Torch Digest, the Apalachicola Regional Stewardship Alliance, and then we also talked with the Longleaf Alliance and some of their local implementation teams to get feedback, trying basically to cast as broad of a net as we could. I'll also note that what we were looking to do was get responses from people based on their primary management units, not Longleaf as a whole. So there's a huge amount, obviously, of knowledge that's out there. But what we wanted to do is get some idea of the spatial variation of that knowledge. So we said, think about your primary responsibility, whether that's an individual state park, national forest, commercial timberland, or private landholding, and give us your responses based on that. We weren't honestly sure what kind of response we were going to get. We got 317, which we thought was outstanding, and I'll talk about the demographics of that in just a second. What we've done so far is done some work on descriptive statistics. We've done some preliminary analyses that I'll talk about today, but we have other work that's going to be ongoing over the course of the year. So this is really just sort of a starter with some basic things. And I'd love your feedback as we go through today, or email me. I'll give you my email address at the end of the day if you guys have other input for this. Also note, and there's some of this which I really haven't gotten to because this is one of the things that's going to be a little bit more labor intensive. There's going to be some qualitative analyses to inform the quantitative results where we're doing qualitative coding and other things. And I'll give you just a sample of that with some quotes that are going to be relevant to what I'll be talking about today in just a few minutes. The demographics, one of the things we really hoped for was a broad response. So what you can see here in terms of management, about half of the people either were government folks, and I'll talk about that distribution or breakdown in just a second. But we did get good participation by individual landholders. We got decent representation by those who manage longleaf on corporate areas. There were a couple other classifications within that, and we in some cases were able to lump some of these additional ones back up into other groups. And we made it clear in giving the survey that if people were uncomfortable talking about that, and it's entirely understandable why they might be, they didn't need to tell us that. There were a range of questions people could answer without saying, I work for the National Forest Service, or I work for international paper, whoever it might happen to be. So all told, we did get identifications for management from about 200 people, and then about 100 folks gave us responses, but declined to give us what their management or landholding classification might be. Of the government folks, that was split. So we got good participation from those working with different state agencies. We had high participation with those from federal agencies. And then a couple of folks who also chimed in with counties or cities as well. So the point to that is we got feedback from a pretty broad constituency, and that was something we were happy about, both the overall number, but also not just getting a perspective that was dominated, for instance, by folks working with federal land management agencies. Similarly, we asked if people were comfortable to talk about what their state was. So we got responses from across the range, although it was variable. I'll mention today just a few different state breakdowns, although honestly, we really didn't get much significant, at least that we found so far. So in doing states, we've been lumping Alabama and Mississippi together. We've been lumping Louisiana and Texas together, and then we've been lumping North Carolina, and then the handful of people we got from Virginia. But again, you can see responses from across the region. And again, that was something that we were interested in trying to capture. All right, now that window is really irritating because it's right there in the middle. So this is prioritizing stands within a management unit. So I'll have a number of slides like this. What I'll give you is the question from the survey, and that'll be in gold. And then what some of the responses are. And I'll just kind of walk you through these. And some of these are just going to be, think about whether these match your expectations and if you have any follow-up questions on it, I'll be sort of curious about. So the first question we said is, for the characteristics listed below, please rank your top 3 criteria for determining whether a site has a high priority for burning. So this is really sort of looking within your stand, the criteria that people, or within your unit, excuse me, the criteria that people were most interested in emphasizing, first of all, largely had to do with ecology. It was length of time since the last burn, overall ecosystem health of a site, and then fuel reduction. Secondarily, a lot of folks talked about the presence of threatened and endangered species. And then oftentimes included, maybe as a second or third ranking, were some of these other things like fire breaks, distance to developed areas, presence of invasive species or plants, not just non-natives, but also other types of invasives, or management of a site for timber. So what you see are ecology, and you see risk management sort of bubbling to the top of these. Now, if you break that out by government managers, corporate managers, and individual landholders, the first 3 of those were consistent across the board. The 2 areas where we had differences when we did some basic statistical analyses were individual landholders were less inclined to talk about or emphasizing presence of threatened and endangered species, but they were very concerned about the presence of invasive plants. So that could be invasive herdwoods, for instance, that are coming into these areas. There were no significant differences among states, and those were really the only 2 things that we had come out amongst the different landholding groups. So really what you see is the concerns and the ways in which areas were being prioritized really were pretty similar, irrespective of who the owners were and across the entire range of Longleaf, with just a couple of specific examples. All right, so third question, how often on average should Longleaf pine stands in your unit be burned? Almost 80% said every 2 to 4 years. A couple said a little bit more frequently, but just a handful of folks said beyond that. And I'll just note that that matches the historic interval for longleaf pine fire returns. So that was not all that surprising to us. The second question that is follow-up to that was, in practice, how often on average have longleaf pine units in your area been burned over the past 10 years? And for this, what we saw is that almost half the respondents said less frequently than you would typically want them to be. A couple said they're burning more often, and usually in the follow-up, they noted that was for specific things like hunting or hardwood control, or for managing for certain purposes. But when you get almost half the folks saying they can't burn as often as they think they should, the question becomes, why is that? Is it management objectives? Does it have to do with constraints that are being placed on them? So what we do is we'll take that and we'll start to kind of try and unpack and tease apart what some of those constraints or reasons might be. Okay, we sort of lumped those reasons into 2 different things. So on the one hand, what are some institutional constraints to burning? So we asked, do the following factors pose constraints to prescribe burning at your unit? What you see in the black bars are those that people regularly responded are often a constraint to what they do. So these were constraints associated with proximity of residential or other developed areas, concerns about risk or liability, also avoiding public concerns over the use of burning. And that was actually a little bit less frequently cited constraint for commercially owned lands, but was one that was regularly cited by the other two groups. There wasn't so much of a concern about challenges posed by agreements and partnerships or limited incentives or legal constraints. These were things that sometimes came up, but they weren't necessarily a regular constraint that many of our respondents were citing as a big challenge to the types of things that they do. All right, those constraints, by the way, are things that oftentimes you might see all year round. I mean, there might be some seasonality to them, but we wanted to pull out things that had a very distinctly seasonal component to them. So the second part of that question then was, we recognize that the specific dates of activities may vary over the full historic range of longleaf pine, but in thinking about your management unit over the last 10 years, what are some of the things that constrain burning in the dormant season, the early spring candling season, which is when longleaf first starts to leaf out, but it doesn't have protective needles, the main part of the growing season, and then in the sort of wind down as we head into fall. We didn't ask it by specific months because that's going to vary. I mean, when fires are implemented in North Carolina, very well might not coincide with those in Central Florida or Louisiana. So we asked folks to tell us, how do you define these 4 different seasons? We gave them the criteria for what they are, and then we sort of constructed this matrix of what is the dormant season in your area, candling season, growing season, and fall. And we then asked people to respond based on those seasons rather than having them target specific months. And this is just one example of what that graphic might look like. Those of you guys in the audience who are fire managers, you know this varies across the region. You can probably sort of align that with what your own fire management patterns are like in your areas. Now it's important because if you look at fires that are being conducted during the dormant season, so in winter, maybe sometimes even in early spring, these are often used to reduce fuels. They're used to reclaim stands that have an insufficient burn history. They're used because they produce a cooler fire. There's less damage to longleaf seedling buds. But the problem is they might top kill some of the undesirable hardwoods in those areas like sweet gum or water oak, depending on where you're at. But often the fires aren't hot enough to actually kill them off, so then you get resprouting during the following growing season. So you get what you see here in this image to the right. And this is what a longleaf pine stand burned every 3 years, what might look like if it's being burned primarily in the dormant season. Now that differs from growing season burns, which are often used to control understory and midstory hardwoods, minimize that resprouting. You can see that in the image here. There's a difference as to what the understory looks like. Those fires are likely to be more intense. They're likely to be more damaging to plants because the air temperatures are higher, the moisture conditions are different. And it's also significant because in general, this corresponds to the evolutionary fire season, which again, depending on your area, might start to kick up in April and then run through areas of the summer. So given that, what we asked our respondents was, please indicate how often these factors constrain prescribed burning in your management unit during each period of longleaf pine phenology using the following scores for your rankings. So this was sort of a not a problem, occasionally or rarely a problem, or regularly serves as a constraint. The takeaway, because there's just so much here that I don't have time to get through it, but I'm more than happy to answer this in follow-ups, was that the growing season in general is more constrained by weather, fuel loads, and resource availability than the dormant season. I'll talk about what those specific constraints are in just a second. Air quality is commonly cited all throughout. That's smoke management, that's other types of things that managers have to deal with. So if you look at inappropriate weather conditions, for instance, it's an issue all throughout the year, but preferentially maybe a little bit more so even in the growing season. Now, for those conditions, what we said is please check boxes on the survey for all factors that are common constraints on prescribed burning. And during the dormant season, the main responses that we got were low relative humidity, high wind speeds, number of days since rain, and low atmospheric dispersion, which influences smoke management. Growing season, more responses overall, high temperatures, and again, these are not surprising, right? High temperatures, drought conditions, number of days since rain, things associated with relative humidity or low wind speeds or low atmospheric dispersion. So to put this in bigger context, what we're trying to do is get this idea that if we look forward to how is prescribed burning in Longleaf going to take place in 2050 or 2070 or 2090, what we're trying to do is get at what some of the constraints are that fire managers currently face today. There's some of that out there. There's a lot of informal knowledge, but what we want to do is sort of gather this together to get some feedback from people who do this right now. All right, this is not quantitative. These are just some quotes that were pulled out, which I think help to emphasize the things that I've been talking about. So these were a couple of specific quotes that we have. Due to the limited number of good burn days in the dormant season, I'm seeing more landowners switch to growing season burns. And this was by a fire manager in Mississippi. And that was something we maybe weren't necessarily expecting, was a switch to growing season. We'll come back to that in significance or importance in just a minute. Capacity is the biggest problem. We're expanding the acres of Longleaf on the district, but have lost firefighters that have not been replaced and therefore cannot take full advantage of our limited burn days. We've been doing quite a bit of mechanical and chemical work to widen our burn windows. That might include arranging fuels by mowing or using herbicides. This has not always worked because if the area is not burned in the planned window, conditions may be worse when the site does finally get burned. And there are not enough burning days to get all our needs met within a 2-year rotation. There are too many units with narrow burn windows due to smoke direction and heavy fuels in the wild and urban interface to be able to get to them all under restrictions. So if we kind of put together, and this will be the first half or 2/3 of my results, 2 takeaways are you have major factors affecting burn unit prioritization. Really didn't vary much across management or ownership types, and there really wasn't much variation across states. I also want to pull out that nearly half the managers reported burning less frequently than stands in their unit should be. So what that reflects is constraints due to a range of different factors that I've talked about over the last 10 or 15 minutes. Okay, broadly speaking, those are including institutional constraints like development and risk avoidance. And if we look forward, those are things that have a lot to do with future land use change that brings more and more people into close proximity of areas where managers might want to burn. And there's also these sort of seasonal environmental constraints, especially in the growing season, driven by things like appropriate weather conditions and drought and wind speeds, which influence atmospheric dispersion. And what our previous research has shown that those restrictions and burn windows based on those variables are likely going to remain or maybe even increase in the future, which brings up this importance of thinking about how climate might change in the upcoming decades. All right, that brings me to what I'll talk about for the last 10 minutes or so. We asked, looking ahead, 30 years from now, which of these constraints do you think will be the most significant to the use of prescribed burning at your unit? And you can pick up to several of these. And the things that came out is basically everybody said air quality. Most everybody said nearby human development. A big chunk of folks said risk aversion. Another big chunk of folks said inappropriate weather conditions. And then also things like public concerns and shortage of resources and manpower. And then maybe slightly less significant things for fuel loads and institutional incentives. Okay, that, by the way, is a lot of what we see for current constraints, right? So they're thinking the things that are currently constraining burn programs are likely to continue as we move forward 10 or 30, or as we'll talk about in a second, 50 years down the road. This will be somewhat interesting. So overall, how do you expect the availability of future suitable burning opportunities to change in each of these seasonal periods? And there's a lot of numbers there, so I'll point you just to the 3 things along the bottom. Okay, so if you look down here, roughly half of the respondents expect burning opportunities to be either somewhat or greatly reduced if you look 30 years out. Okay, another roughly 30 to 40 to, in some seasons, as much as 50% say there won't be any change. And only a very small percent expects burning opportunities to increase. So that's saying that people are thinking about and they're recognizing that burning opportunities, which in many areas right now are already sort of a little bit hard to come by in some years, are likely to maybe be reduced somewhat further, albeit with some variations within these 4 different seasons. All right, question 13 was, to what extent do you think future urbanization patterns, changes in the wild and urban interface, loss of habitat to restore longleaf pine ecosystems, will affect your prescribed burning decisions. And we ask people to do that 3 different time frames, 5 to 10 years into the future, 10 to 30 years into the future, and then 30 to 50 years into the future. And I'll point you to 2 things. The percentage of people who say urbanization is not going to really change or affect their processes at all actually decreases, and it decreases pretty rapidly within the next couple of decades. And what you see is a shift from those who said that urbanization is maybe affecting them a little bit or maybe moderately, that as they start to think about 30 to 50 years out, almost 70% of the respondents are saying urbanization is going to affect the decisions that they're making. Okay, that's important to think about how we start to manage or come up with prescribed burning programs 30 to 50 years down the road. Okay, we'll also talk about the fact that even though that might seem like a long ways off, 1 or 2 of the quotes that I'll pull out are actually significant in terms of current management in thinking about these longer term fire management plans in the face of urbanization. All right, question 12 was, to what extent do you think future climate change, increasing temperature, more intense rainstorms, or extreme weather events will affect your prescribed burning decisions? Again, what we see a few decades out is not at all, and that drops down to about 10%, just a couple decades down the road. We see a significant increase in those who responded a great deal, but that significant increase still only gets up to about 40 to 50%. So what that's coupled with is a significant increase in the amount of uncertainty. Again, it's probably not something that's surprising. You know, if you think about how climate change is going to impact the things that you do, the further out you go, the bigger the amount of uncertainty exists. Even given that, what we still see is a large increase in the number of people who are thinking there's going to be impacts on what their burning regimes and what their burning programs are likely to be doing in the face of climate change. All right, once again, just a few quotes, because I like these just because they give you sort of some context to me, and I can show you the numbers and the figures and things. But if you look at some of these quotes, the key is to get the fuels reduced as soon as possible before urbanization, and to keep these areas in a 2 to 3 year fire return interval. That goes back to something I mentioned just a second ago. It might seem like, well, you know, urbanization becomes a bigger issue 30 years out. But if you can't get a hold on what's happening with current management now, that's going to be compounded as climate or as urbanization become increasingly greater constraints on the types of things that take place maybe a few decades down the road. And that was something that I thought came out nicely with this quote. A commercial forest manager said, each new development of private property near our forest boundary increases the difficulty of burning nearby. That could be through smoke management, it can be through risk and other types of issues, but the notion that increasing development becomes more constraining, even for some of these larger commercial forest managers, is something that's really significant, something to think about down the road. Number 3, and there were actually a couple comments that were similar to this one, but I pulled this one out just as an example of it. Urbanization itself is not the only issue, but acceptance of prescribed fire by those moving into the wild and urban interface is the bigger issue. People that have lived in dense urban areas are moving into more rural areas, and they don't understand fire and its benefits to the ecosystem and their homes. Other comments talked about the significance of education and working with folks in the areas around where fires are going to be taking place. 4, weather conditions and personnel workload often prohibit units from being burned on optimum scheduled years. And what that gets sort of brought in with later in that comment that I'll include here is the issue of what if those windows become even less predictable? And that's something that our paper in IJWF starts to address. But the last quote I've got, and then I'll just about wrapped up, is if there is not some sort of liability reform and a greater understanding of the actual economic benefit to the insurance industry of prescribed burning, well, that's a big deal. The math needs to be done to show they lose less by supporting prescribed fire, which saves wildfire losses, even though there will be individual prescribed fire losses. And I bring this up just because a couple of other folks in their responses, and those of you guys that do this absolutely know this, the issue of liability and risk is central to some of the decisions that folks are making. And if you look even around the Southeast, this idea of the types of insurance that are involved, whether it's simple negligence or gross negligence, look at the standard of liability under which a person is legally, or an organization, is legally responsible for harm if something bad happens. And several of the respondents talked about the need for assessing or meeting or just sort of dealing with these issues of insurance and how that sort of goes along with economic benefits and risk calculations that managers are going to be making, not only today, but potentially are even more significant as you move down the road if fire becomes harder and harder to carry out in landscapes that are increasingly more developed. All right, so take-home message. You can see I'm very excited here. So as we look forward, a couple take-home messages are this. Roughly half of the managers expect reduced burn opportunities over the next 3 decades, especially in spring and summer. There is widespread agreement that urbanization is going to pose increasingly more constraints. That can be due to risk, can be due to air quality or other types of issues. Climate change is also expected to constrain burning, but the uncertainty involved in that is something that we want to explore a little bit more as we go through the quotes and explore and talk about some of the questions that I didn't even really get at in today's presentation. So the question then becomes, can managers adjust their activities to meet the increasing challenge posed by development and by changing fire weather? Can they shift to different seasons? Well, that might be difficult if the dormant season already has a lot of burning going on and resources aren't there. Brings in other types of constraints that I talked about in the first part of today's talk. If you shift to different seasons, or if you conduct your burns earlier in the morning, or if you do them on weekends, the effects of burning may or may not achieve certain management goals. So burning in the dormant season isn't the same as burning in summer. So how does that impact what folks want to be able to do? And it might just be that such shifts can prevent managers from burning as frequently as desired at a time where we're already seeing a lot of people saying they'd like to burn more often, but they really can't for a range of other reasons that may be difficult for them to deal with. All right, apologize in that, well, A for the box, but also in that this is sort of a progress report, so to speak. So we've got stuff that we'll be doing and building on this over the course of the next year. So one of the things that, again, I encourage you to do is both in the questions now, or if we don't get to them over the next 10 minutes, my email address is here. It's just kupfer@sc.edu. I'm easy to find or just look. I can't remember if it's in the call for this, but contact me and follow up. I'm more than happy to talk with those of you guys who are interested in this topic. And also, of course, like to acknowledge some of the other folks who've been involved in this, Ellie Davis and Casey Teskey, who've helped on the surveying and some of the initial analyses. Funding from the Southeast Climate Adaptation Science Center, which is what started this and is going to continue this research over the course of the next year. And I can't emphasize enough, hopefully some of you guys who took that survey are on this. It was not a short survey. So I know those of you guys who did the whole thing, I'm sure it took you 20 or 30 minutes. And that's a big commitment. So we really appreciated both those who distributed it through the Southern Fire Exchange and the other organizations I talked about earlier, but especially the 300 odd people who took the time to respond. We'll be getting those preliminary results out to you guys relatively soon, but feel free to contact me or Dr. Dow if you guys have interest in that. And that, I don't know, Carrie, how you like to handle questions?
Sure, John. Thanks for that great presentation. This is Hillary. I'll go ahead and help with moderating Q&A. If you are up for turning on your webcam, it might be nice to see your smiling face as we chat with you. I'd say we have 5 or 6 minutes for questions, so I'll just go ahead and open the floor. Does anyone have a question for John? You're welcome to just unmute yourself and speak up or use the chat box. I do actually have a question from Mitch Eaton in the chat box that I can use just to get us started. Questions related to proximity development and those related to risk were asked separately. How correlated do you believe those two issues are to managers, and what aspects of risk and development proximity are differentiated by managers?
I think they're heavily, and even the prioritization in that opening slide, or one of the early slides, I should say, where we talked about issues of restoration and species and so on and so forth. A number of the responses are undoubtedly tied together. So this idea of risk, right now, what we've seen in the responses is that most of the people who were citing concerns about risk were citing issues not with risk on a site, but with those external to it. So it was risk with people moving into the areas with potential fire escape. One thing that didn't come up that is specific to it, and especially if climate warms, will be a risk to personnel. So, you know, if it gets hotter, and some of the things that we are expecting to see take place, that puts firefighters at greater risk, especially if we're talking about growing season burns. So as we look forward to it, I think there's a lot of ties between risk, WUI development, and how it sort of begins to interface with these types of areas. And I freely admit, you know, as with some of these statistics, there is some conflation between those two types of things. And hopefully when we look through some of the comments, we can maybe see if there's something that we've missed, or we can at least flesh out that just a little bit more. Hopefully that would answer Mitch's question.
Thanks. And a quick one from Laurel in the chat. When will the Journal of Wildland Fire article you manage be published?
So it is online right now. It has not yet been assigned an issue, but I would expect it will be in the next month or two.
Okay, great.
I know that if you go there right now, if you or your institution doesn't have a subscription, you'll be able to see the abstract and the other things. When it is sort of processed through, it's going to be open access. So just sort of keep checking back, and hopefully within the next few weeks, you should be able to get the entire article. But if you just can't wait, email me and I'm more than happy to send it to y'all.
Okay, great, thanks. I'm going to pause, and I do have one more question in the chat that I can share, but just I'm going to pause and see if anybody wants to verbally ask a question before I do.
Hi, Bill Hoffman. I have a question for you. I really like that figure at the beginning where you, in the article from Journal of Wildland Fire. And so that obviously depends on combining projections of climate change and some set of rules used to determine whether an appropriate, whether a given day is an appropriate burn day. And I'm wondering if in your survey, you've been doing if you've included any questions to try to quantify the rules that people may be using in their particular situation to decide whether or not it's a day for burning or not.
It's a great question, and yeah, I'm sure it wouldn't surprise you that when that article was going through review, one of the fundamental questions was, where did you get those numbers from, and sort of documentation for it. So we had drawn those both from talking with wildland fire managers, looking through regional fire books and things like that. We had thought about for this survey including some backing to that, which is I think what you're suggesting is, did we ask, you know, for instance with temperature, the thresholds we were using were from about 0 degrees Celsius up to 32.5 degrees Celsius. And one of the things that we are interested in doing, this will probably be follow-up surveying, is are people willing to expand that upper level is really mostly what we're concerned about. If it gives them more burning days, or how hard and fast is that, or what goes into their calculations of those numbers. And the answer I'll give you, which is maybe not a great one, is I would love to have done that, but we were really concerned about the length of the survey as it was. So I think to get the kind of feedback that we wanted, the thought was sort of hold that for now, let a little bit of time pass, and then maybe sort of hit the well again sometime in the next year. I know Adam is sort of starting to think about sort of a risk-focused kind of paper with Kevin and me and some other folks. So it might be that that crops back up. So you're absolutely right, and I would have loved to have had that. We were just concerned about survey length already. Thanks, Bill. That's a good question.
Thanks. I'm going to jump over to the chat box and share one. Has there been any research on urbanization growth rates in longleaf areas to get an idea about what we may see in the next few decades? I could kind of envision overlaying, you know, sleuth with a longleaf range map and taking a stab at that, but do you have anything more specific to share?
That's probably the best thing. There have been a couple studies, including Am's work and some of these other sleuth-based models that are looking at that and then overlaying it with areas of management. There have been a few papers, I know one by Volker Radeloff up at Madison, who have looked at the growth of the WUI over the last 2 or 3 decades that could also sort of provide a historic perspective to what that might be. I don't know, apart from doing that, of any, there may be actually folks on here who do, but the main ones I know are just these sort of sleuth or other similar types of models that are predicting growth throughout the region as a whole, and then trying to sort of overlay that with historic or active areas of longleaf.
Sounds good. Yeah, if anybody knows of a great paper or a model that does that, please feel free to share that in the chat. I've got one more from the chat box from Ryan Boyle at the Southeast Climate Adaptation Science Center. What approaches might fire managers take to adapt with this new research knowledge? Might be getting more comfortable with burning in less than optimal conditions, or trying to burn more acres when we do have good conditions? And speaking to capacity, is that more of a staff availability problem or more of an issue of training existing staff? This might have to be our last question just for time.
Okay, thanks, Ryan. Yeah, one of the things that we talk about in the IJWF paper, and that will come out in this one once we get this all together, is probably a little bit of all the different things that you mentioned. So yeah, the issue of getting more comfortable with burning in less than optimal conditions is one that we really want to know, because it's probably something that is going to need to happen. A number of the respondents even said, burn more hectares when you can, but for some of these areas, especially for some of the bigger federal land holdings, there are specific blocks that are in cycles, and it sometimes can be hard if you get out of sequence to catch back up, or if you're trying to get caught back up, then it becomes an issue again of capacity for doing that, whether it's machinery or people or other things like that. The idea or issue of capacity for staffing is one that in a number of the responses, particularly from individual landholders, you might remember the one question was, how often should your area be burned? And we were comparing that to how often is it? One of the things that repeatedly came out in the comments was, for individual landholders, they would like to burn more often, but they seem to be those that were most constrained in what they were able to do. So approaches, one is, you burn earlier in the morning. Some areas you can do that, some you can't. Some areas you might be able to shift seasons, at least to some of these maybe shoulder areas, so burning a little bit more in maybe March or April, unless that's going to impact longleaf. These are all things that, I hate to make blanket statements about the region, because a lot of it is going to be specific to those areas. But it's going to be a challenge, if in fact, especially some of these areas where summer burning basically goes away, which is what our numbers are predicting, it's going to be hard to make that up.
Sounds good, thanks. I'm going to go ahead and share, well, first briefly, I want to remind everyone, because we did have some people join in the middle of the talk, that if you want SAF credit for your continuing forestry education credits, please chat Ashlyn Shore in the chat with your name and email address to make sure that we capture your attendance to get those credits. And then I am going to just take back a presenter power here for a minute and just close with a quick preview of next month's webinar. And then I know we did have some other questions in the chat, so potentially if you are free to stay an extra couple minutes, John, maybe we could hang out and get those additional questions answered. So as I mentioned in the beginning, this is the final webinar in our great collaborative webinar series, and I want to say a huge thank you to Carrie Furness and Ashlyn Shore with the Southeast Climate Adaptation Science Center for all of their help with this series. This was a really fun collaboration, and I hope you all got something out of it. I want to preview next month's webinar really quick. We're going to be kind of going back to this typical South Atlantic third Thursday web forum format. And so we're going to have Rua Mordecai, who's the science coordinator for the Southeast and the South Atlantic blueprints, presenting on the latest update to the South Atlantic Conservation Blueprint, Blueprint 2020. So he'll be giving us an overview of the improved indicators, the new methods that are behind this update to the South Atlantic Blueprint. And one quick shameless plug, it is not too late to register for a workshop to review this latest South Atlantic Blueprint 2020. If you go to the website southatlanticlcc.org, there's a blog on the homepage that will direct you on how to register for a workshop, as well as how to access the online data for the latest South Atlantic Blueprint draft. If you'd rather just review it on your own, there's a feedback form that you can submit to give us your thoughts. So the South Atlantic Blueprint, of course, is an input to the Southeast Conservation Blueprint, that blue map that John showed early in his talk. So that's it for me. Thank you guys again so much for tuning in, and big thanks to John and Carrie and Ashlyn for their work on this presentation today. I will say that if John looked like you were maybe willing to hang out for a couple of minutes to answer any additional questions. So I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing again and just open the floor for any additional questions. There are a couple more in the chat box I can go back to, but if you have something else you want to speak up to John, please feel free.
Okay. I know one of the questions that did come in, I'll just highlight it, I responded to it, was somebody asked if we had done any consultation with tribes on traditional burning practices, and the answer is no, we haven't. When I presented part of these results at the Southeast CASC meeting in New Orleans, I did have some sort of offline conversations with folks who are involved in that, and that's a great idea. And that was something that I don't think we had any respondents from that group when I think back through the demographics.
Gotcha. Thanks for speaking to that. Is there anything else that you want to share? I know you talked a little bit about capacity and staffing on a previous question, but any other suggestions on how to build additional capacity by training new burn managers?
It's hard, and probably some of the folks on here can speak to that even better than I can, but to me, one of the things that I'll highlight, and I said this during the talk, but I'll bring it back up, is something that I both see when, give you a little bit of background on me. So I'm at the University of South Carolina, and I work a lot with folks down at Congaree National Park, which is close to here. I'm also a former National Park Service seasonal. I worked at Indiana Dunes as part of their burn crew. So one of the things that we see is the importance of education and working with folks in the surrounding areas. So I just want to once again underscore this issue of how difficult it can be, but yet how important it's going to be moving forward in the next few decades of addressing the need for burning with folks in the surrounding areas who might not be familiar with it, with the economic benefits, interfacing with insurance companies. I taught, before coming to USC, I taught at the University of Arizona, and we've had, of course, some terrible fires in the last couple of years in Tucson, including just a month or two ago. And I know the folks there in Coronado National Forest, their efforts to burn were sometimes so constrained, and it was so difficult to interact with folks, not because the people were being intransigent about it, but it's just difficult in making those decisions. Sort of the error of omission versus commission becomes a big one for some of these folks.
Gotcha. Well, thanks for speaking to that a little bit more. Last chance for questions. Anybody else?
Mitch?
Mitch,
yeah. I've, if no one else does, I have another question related to the perception of the managers regarding the fire return interval and what's sort of optimal for achieving their habitat or system state outcomes. It seems like I assume there's a lot of data that would be available to do a more empirical analysis of sort of state transition probabilities. Is that something that you've, and this comes from some work I've done in Florida with scrub habitat and managed fire as well as mechanical clearing to try to achieve particular states for a sort of mid-successional habitat, and what we found was that the empirical data showed a fair divergence from what the managers who've been working on these lands for a long time really felt like their understanding was. And so we started with their sort of priors on that, and then try to use the data that we had to refine those estimates in the hopes of doing some analysis that would sort of provide some more of an optimization for the management. Is that something that you guys have thought about or are doing now, or might be possible to do?
I'll put that into the possible to do category. We've had a number of other things with this project that we've been sort of trying to wrap up and or get off the ground. When you're talking about it, it's interesting because I had a study a few years ago that I did with some folks out in California. We're looking at burning at lava beds national monuments. And one of the things that we were doing was looking at very similar to what you're talking about, which was looking at state and transition models across the transition from lowland grassland areas all the way up into ponderosa pine areas. And we had sample plots. We also sort of drew on the fire effects plots the National Park Service had laid out in those areas. And we were looking at the factors that were influencing divergence of whether something, for instance, came back as sagebrush or not in areas that had traditionally been sagebrush. So, you know, this idea of sort of getting at two things, I think. One is what the perceptions of what are going to happen is not always sort of the reality of what happens, particularly when there's so many other variables that are changing. And you have so many sort of contingent processes which can deflect what's going on. The one thing I will say is I've talked with Kevin Hires. He has a lot of fire effects data from Eglin and a few of the other areas in Florida. And we've talked about doing something sort of similar to that. So a lot of my personal research is focused on ecological succession and then trying to track out some of these things over time. So some of the data you're talking about could, I think, easily be folded in with some of the work that Kevin and other folks have done down in those areas. I'm sure you're familiar with some of the stuff he's done. So that was maybe a long, rambling response. I apologize if that wasn't really what you're asking, but I think it's a great question. It's just Adam and Kevin and I joke that we sort of have paper 1 now done, paper 2 and 3 almost done, and then we have sort of paper 2B, 5C, and all of these other ideas. And we're just sort of trying to figure out how best to invest our time.
Oh, that helps. That's understandable, and I can talk to Adam more about that if helpful.
Yeah, and feel free to talk to me about it too offline. I'd be interested if we can come up with something to do for that.
Great. I'll make one last pause here in case anybody else has a burning question.
Haha.
Ha ha ha, yes, pun intended. All right, that sounds like it, and it is 8 after, so we'll let you go, John. Thanks so much for your time and for your extra time. This was fun. Hopefully we'll do it again. This was really interesting talk. So thanks again, everybody, for joining, and have a great rest of your week and weekend, and hopefully you'll join us in August for our next talk. Bye, everybody.
Yeah, thanks, John. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you all.